everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen, maybe. All right, hopefully everyone is seeing my intro title slide. Perfect, good deal. So again, thank you for joining today. I'm very much looking forward to sharing some of the information from this didactic. I have a quick story to share that as I started working on gathering information in this area as it pertains to, as Harry shared, I'm a consultant and trainer for the first teams that we work with here at the Best Center at Neomed, and it's an area that we really wanted to focus some attention on to assist our partner agencies and our teams on working with individuals. And so we started to really look in this topic area of looking at resilience, looking at social determinants of health, and as I started to gather this information, I really quickly um, started to recognize my discomfort in the topic in terms of what I was looking at and what I was reading. And I quickly attributed it to the fact that for a lot of what we're going to talk about today, it wasn't something that I personally had had a lot of experience with, in specifically dealing with being a white male. It wasn't something that I had a lot of challenges with. And so I was talking with my family about, boy, I'm just really uncomfortable. It's difficult. I don't know if I'm the best person to talk about this. And my daughter at the time was 12 years old. And in the infinite wisdom of a 12-year-old, she said to me, just because it's uncomfortable to you, Dad, doesn't mean that you shouldn't talk about it. And I thought, well, hey, that's a good point. And so part of my goal for the didactic today is to just get everyone to think a little bit about how they approach their work with individuals and the natural supports that they work with, and thinking about how everyone's journey is different. And how can we form supportive and healthy relationships and partnerships with those individuals that are coming to see us. And then also, again, as my daughter said, just because it makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean you shouldn't talk about it. And so, just to start off with, I'd like for everybody to think about a time, and if it helps you, you can close your eyes. It's entirely up to you. But I want you to think about a time where you approached a supervisor at work about a struggle, a work-related struggle that you were experiencing. And I want you to think about how you felt when you were going into the meeting. I want you to think a little bit about what was that interaction like? When you were talking with your supervisor, what did the experience go like? And then when that was over and you were leaving that meeting, how were you feeling about the meeting? And what was your takeaway, if you will, from that interaction with your supervisor? We're going to come back to that at the end of the didactic today and just kind of process that a little bit and relate it to the topics that we're going to talk about, that I'm going to talk about today. So here are my objectives for what we're going to talk about in terms of resilience, and how resilience is in its role in programming and working with individuals, and looking at social determinants of health, and the role that they play with individuals that we work with, and what's the impact of those social determinants of health, what impact does it have on resilience for individuals. So resilience is something that is discussed a lot. And with regard to a lot of coordinated specialty care for first episode psychosis programs or our first program, resilience is a huge topic. It is something that is brought up a lot when working with individuals, and it's often seen as a point of emphasis. The idea of resilience is assisting individuals to get back where they were before they came in to engage in services. And so the idea would be this would improve long-term outcomes for them. And a lot of times, resiliency is viewed as a trait when we're working with individuals. So I've heard frequently, and I think even myself, I may have said it in one way, shape, or form, that wow, they're just not very resilient. And that's an example of resilience being viewed as a trait, that it's either something that an individual has or they do not have. And so oftentimes that may be viewed as something very specific. So if somebody's coming in and they say, I really want to get back to work, and it's something that they're struggling with finding employment, maybe they're struggling with filling out an application, maybe they're struggling with doing job searches. And so it might be something where they might be viewed as not being resilient. And so that's in that one situation that the individual maybe is struggling. But when we look at resilience as a trait, it's often generalized to all aspects of their life. And so that's something that we want to keep in mind, that there are examples of where individuals have been resilient and they've have been able to quote unquote bounce back um, in some aspect of their life, but may still be struggling in other areas. So I wanted to read this, and DeLuca and colleagues had a really good quote when looking at resilience, especially as it relates to psychosis. And it says, collectively, research on the intersection of resilience and psychosis suggests that really resilience should be seen as a dynamic, multifaceted construct encompassing both internal and external dimensions. So, for example, genetic, neurobiological, psychological, socioeconomic, contextual, and cultural factors that interact with each other in complex ways to facilitate the ongoing process of recovery. So, I want us to think about ways that we can change the way we think about resilience in the individuals that we work with. Thinking about how it depends not only on internal factors, but also those external factors, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute. And if we can start to view resilience as being on a continuum, if you will, that there are aspects of an individual's life where they may be very resilient, and then there may be other aspects of their life where they may be struggling. So if we can start to think of it as being on a continuum and have many different influential factors, as I mentioned, and I'll talk about that here in a second. So when we think about the ways that we approach resilience, we need to think about some of the conditions and situations and challenges and obstacles that individuals that we work with are confronted with on a regular basis. And so we need to think about what are some of those areas? Could racism, poverty, exposure to violence, drugs, crimes. They're all issues of social justice that require advocacy. And so a lot of times we can't just, we need to think about our approach and change our approach in that we need to think about it. Is it telling someone they need to be more resilient in the face of these challenges? Is that really addressing the core issue or the problems and the challenges that individuals are experiencing? Or are we just telling them that they need to fight against oftentimes systems that have been in place for a really, really, really long time? So the idea of conditions must be altered. And so, as an example, for some of our partner agencies that we work with in the first episode psychosis field, a lot of times individuals are coming in and they're hearing, okay, be resilient. You can get back to where you were before. But a lot of times they're coming in and they are exhausted because being resilient is all that they've had to do. They've had to be resilient their whole life. And they are just exhausted from being resilient all of the time. And so here it is another situation where we're telling them, hey, just hey, pull your boots on and just get to work and dig in. And that may not be something that they are appreciating or wanting to hear at that given moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about social determinants of health. And I know for some of you this might be a review, but thinking about social determinants of health and being any environmental, social, structural factors that affect incidence, prevalence, prognosis of a disease. So this includes health inequities. It includes early life adversities, social connections, poverty, structural racism, migration, food insecurity. And so, one of the things when we think about social determinants of health, it should not be viewed as a cause of mental illness, but it does contribute to or exacerbate underlying symptomology. So, they can influence, for example, if we look at psychosis, social determinants can influence the age of onset of psychosis in those that are at risk, or they can worsen conditions associated with psychosis. And so, we want to keep that in mind that it's not necessarily the cause, but it certainly it makes things more challenging for individuals when they are experiencing psychosis. So, in kind of tying together what I've talked about, thinking about resilience, thinking about social determinants of health, what's next? So, what do we do with this information, or what can we do to help the individuals that we're working with? And so looking at things on an individual level, Rosenberg and colleagues had some recommendations or thoughts as it pertains to helping individuals identify their own resilience, can help with the impact of adversity on poor mental health and having it acknowledged. So the idea of telling individuals when we're working with them that, yeah, gosh, this has been a battle. You have had to be resilient in any number of areas for many, many years. This is difficult, and acknowledging that for the individual. Also, helping the individual to identify or recognize the internal and external factors that supported their resilient responses. So they may be traits or skills that they were able to incorporate, and or maybe they were external support systems that were available and they helped the individual. We also want to think about aspects of for different communities. What were some examples of ways that they've had to be um, resilient or persevere in some challenges? So thinking about the African American population and structural racism, thinking about the LGBTQ youth that maybe are struggling because they live in non-affirming homes. Um, Thinking about in the more recent past, also the Asian population threatened during the COVID pandemic. So a lot of those, excuse me, a lot of those are examples of when individuals had very challenging circumstances in their communities that they were dealing with on a daily basis, day after day after day. So, one of the things is that we don't want it to be overwhelming. We don't want it to feel overwhelming. We need to do our homework. We need to understand the individuals that we're working with and understand what have been some of the challenges that they have experienced over the course of their life. We need to do our homework to better understand how can we provide support and advocate for the individuals in their communities that we work with. Now, this next slide I'm going to show you, it's very busy, but it does a good job at looking at ways to approach resilience in a multifaceted way. So it looks at the number of areas that we need to consider when discussing resilience with individuals, keeping in mind that there are both internal and external factors to consider. And oftentimes those may work in combination with each other. External factors influence our internal responses at times. And so a lot of times those external factors that individuals are having to confront are outside of their control. They're not something that they can typically do anything about. But we can think about how can we help individuals to recognize what their internal response might be. And thinking about to yourself, anytime that you've said to yourself about maybe somebody that you're working with, if they would only just try a little bit harder, they could do so much more. if they would just try just a little bit harder. And I know myself, I've said that more frequently than I would like to admit that I have said. And some of the even my response to some of the perceived inactivity that we may see with individuals may be due to their exhaustion, as I touched on earlier, from constantly having to deal with these challenges and being resilient. And so we want to keep those in mind, the internal, external factors that can certainly influence an individual's resilience. On a societal level, thinking about ways that we can help individuals in some of these areas, especially systemic areas where they are presented as challenges for individuals. And I put a word on the slide that it was so important, I put it there 3 times in thinking about advocacy. And advocacy can be many, many different things. You know, for some people, it's carrying a sign, and oftentimes carrying a sign is advocacy. But it can be thinking about and talking with your partner agencies, the agencies that you work with, your colleagues, thinking about ways to advocate for change within the place that you work at, and do your homework and think about how can we look at community change and bringing about community change. All right, so we're going to come back. Beginning of the didactic, I had asked everybody to think about that time that they went into a supervisor's office and they talked about a work-related challenge. And when you think about your responses to some of the questions, so how are you feeling going into the meeting? How did you feel the interaction went? And then after the meeting, how did you feel? And so sometimes some things to consider going in the meeting. Were you scared? Did you feel inadequate? Did you feel ashamed, embarrassed? During the meeting, did you feel supported? Did you feel dismissed? After the meeting, did you come out feeling optimistic or did you come out feeling deflated? And so, in discussion with individuals that have had these experiences with supervisors, sometimes the response from a supervisor might be, well, this is the way it is. You need to just work a little bit harder. You need to figure out how to structure your time better. It's just the way it is, right? And so if you've ever had that type of experience on a smaller degree, but nonetheless, you see what happens when resilience is encouraged, but it's not really addressing the bigger systemic challenges. And so for most of us, work is only a fraction of our lives, and maybe it's a small fraction of our lives. But thinking about participants and individuals that we work with that encounter this type of experience in every walk of life and how challenging that might be. That if they're continually hearing, you need to just work harder, you need to structure your time better, you need to do things a little bit differently. To some degree, if we've ever had an experience like that at work, then you're experiencing what they have. And they are experiencing that in many, many different realms and domains of their life. So just a thought to leave with and relating to some of the experiences that individuals might have that you're working with. Oh, and here are some references. And I am going to stop my share here and see if anybody has any questions, thoughts, comments.
That was excellent, Nick. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that, and I wrote it down that resilience, being resilient is exhausting. I think that